Other wise men of Gotham. One day, news was brought to Gotham that the king was coming that way, and that he would pass through the town. This did not please the men of Gotham at all. They hated the king, for they knew that he was a cruel, bad man. If he came to their town, they would have to find food and lodging for him and his men, and if he saw anything that pleased him, he would be sure to take it for his own. What should they do? They met together to talk the matter over. "Let us chop down the big trees in the woods, so that they will block up all the roads that lead into the town," said one of the wise men. "Good," said all the rest. So they went out with their axes, and soon all the roads and paths to the town were filled with logs and brush. The king's horsemen would have a hard time of it getting into Gotham. They would either have to make a new road, or give up the plan altogether, and go on to some other place. When the king came, and saw that the road had been blocked up, he was very angry. "Who chopped those trees down in my way?" he asked of two country lads that were passing by. "The men of Gotham," said the lads. "Well," said the king, "go and tell the men of Gotham that I shall send my sheriff into their town, and have all their noses cut off." The two lads ran to the town as fast as they could, and made known what the king had said. Everybody was in great fright. The men ran from house to house, carrying the news, and asking one another what they should do. "Our wits have kept the king out of the town," said one, "and so now our wits must save our noses." "True, true," said the others. "But what shall we do?" Then one, whose name was Dobbin, and who was thought to be the wisest of them all, said, "Let me tell you something. Many a man has been punished because he was wise, but I have never heard of anyone being harmed because he was a fool. So, when the king's sheriff comes, let us all act like fools." "Good, good," cried the others. "We will all act like fools." It was no easy thing for the king's men to open the roads, and while they were doing it, the king grew tired of waiting, and went back to London. But very early one morning, the sheriff with a party of fierce soldiers rode through the woods, and between the fields, toward Gotham. Just before they reached the town, they saw a queer sight. The old men were rolling big stones up the hill, and all the young men were looking on, and grunting very loudly. The sheriff stopped his horses, and asked what they were doing. "We are rolling stones uphill to make the sun rise," said one of the old men. "You foolish fellow," said the sheriff. "Don't you know that the sun will rise without any help?" "Ah, will it?" said the old man. "Well, I never thought of that. How wise you are. And what are you doing?" said the sheriff to the young men. "Oh, we do the grunting while our fathers do the working," they answered. "I see," said the sheriff. "Well, that is the way the world goes everywhere," and he rode on toward the town. He soon came to a field where a number of men were building a stone wall. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Why, master," they answered, "there is a cuckoo in this field, and we are building a wall around it so as to keep the bird from straying away." "You foolish fellows," said the sheriff. "Don't you know that the bird will fly over the top of your wall, no matter how high you build it?" "Why, no," they said. "We never thought of that. How very wise you are." The sheriff next met a man who was carrying a door on his back. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I have just started on a long journey," said the man. "But why do you carry that door?" asked the sheriff. "I left my money at home." "Then why didn't you leave the door at home too?" "I was afraid of thieves, and you see, if I have the door with me, they can't break it open and get in." "You foolish fellow," said the sheriff. "It would be safer to leave the door at home, and carry the money with you." "Ah, would it, though?" said the man. "Now, I never thought of that. You." Then the sheriff rode on with his men, but everyone that they met was doing some silly thing. "Truly I believe that the people of Gotham are all fools," said one of the horsemen. "That is true," said another. "It would be a shame to harm such simple people. Let us ride back to London, and tell the king all about them," said the sheriff. "Yes, let us do so," said the horseman. So they went back, and told the king that Gotham was a town of fools, and the king laughed, and said that if that was the case, he would not harm them, but would let them keep their noses. The Miller of the Dee. Once upon a time there lived on the banks of the river Dee a miller, who was the happiest man in England. He was always busy from morning till night, and he was always singing as merrily as any lark. He was so cheerful that he made everybody else cheerful, and people all over the land liked to talk about his pleasant ways. At last the king heard about him. "I will go down and talk with this wonderful miller," he said. "Perhaps he can tell me how to be happy." As soon as he stepped inside of the mill, He heard the miller singing, "I envy nobody, no, not I. For I am as happy as I can be, and nobody envies me." "You're wrong, my friend," said the king. "You're wrong as wrong can be. I envy you, and I would gladly change places with you, if I could only be as light-hearted as you are." The miller smiled, and bowed to the king. "I am sure I could not think of changing places with you, sir," he said. "Now tell me," said the king, "what makes you so cheerful and glad here in your dusty mill, while I, who am king, am sad and in trouble every day?" The miller smiled again, and said, "I do not know why you are sad, but I can easily tell why I am glad. I earn my own bread. I love my wife and my children. I love my friends, and they love me, and I owe not a penny to any man. Why should I not be happy? For here is the river Dee, and every day it turns my mill. And the mill grinds the corn that feeds my wife, my babes, and me." "Say no more," said the king. "Stay where you are, and be happy still. But I envy you. Your dusty cap is worth more than my golden crown. Your mill does more for you than my kingdom can do for me. If there were more such men as you, what a good place this world would be. Goodbye, my friend." The king turned about, and walked sadly away, and the miller went back to his work, singing, "Oh, I'm as happy can be. For I live by the side of the river Dee." Sir Philip Sidney. A cruel battle was being fought. The ground was covered with dead and dying men. The air was hot and stifling. The sun shone down without pity on the wounded soldiers lying in the blood and dust. One of these soldiers was a nobleman, whom everybody loved for his gentleness and kindness. Yet now he was no better off than the poorest man in the field. He had been wounded and would die, and he was suffering much with pain and thirst. When the battle was over, his friends hurried to his aid. A soldier came running with a cup in his hand. "Here, Sir Philip," he said, "I have brought you some clear, cool water from the brook. I will raise your head so that you can drink." The cup was placed to Sir Philip's lips. How thankfully he looked at the man who had brought it. Then his eyes met those of a dying soldier who was lying on the ground close by. The wistful look in the poor man's face spoke plainer than words. "Give the water to that man," said Sir Philip quickly, and then, pushing the cup toward him, he said, "Here, my comrade, take this. Thy need is greater than mine." What a brave, noble man he was. The name of Sir Philip Sidney will never be forgotten, for it was the name of a Christian gentleman who always had the good of others in his mind. Was it any wonder that everybody wept when it was heard that he was dead? It is said that, on the day when he was carried to the grave, every eye in the land was filled with tears. Rich and poor, high and low, all felt that they had lost a friend. All mourned the death of the kindest, gentlest man that they had ever known. The ungrateful soldier. Here is another story of the battlefield, and it is much like the one which I have just told you. Not quite 100 years after the time of Sir Philip Sidney there was a war between the Swedes and the Danes. One day a great battle was fought, and the Swedes were beaten and driven from the field. A soldier of the Danes who had been slightly wounded was sitting on the ground. He was about to take a drink from a flask. All at once he heard someone say, "Oh sir, give me a drink, for I am dying." It was a wounded Swede who spoke. He was lying on the ground only a little way off. The Dane went to him at once. He knelt down by the side of his fallen foe, and pressed the flask to his lips. "Drink," said he, "for thy need is greater than mine." Hardly had he spoken these words, when the Swede raised himself on his elbow. He pulled a pistol from his pocket, and shot at the man who would have befriended him. The bullet grazed the Dane's shoulder, but did not do him much harm. "Ah, you rascal," he cried. "I was going to befriend you, and you repay me, by trying to kill me. Now I will punish you. I would have given you all the water, but now you shall have only half." And with that he drank the half of it, and then gave the rest to the Swede. When the king of the Danes heard about this, he sent for the soldier and had him tell the story just as it was. "Why did you spare the life of the Swede after he had tried to kill you?" asked the king. "Because, sir," said the soldier, "I could never kill a wounded enemy." "Then you deserve to be a nobleman," said the king. And he rewarded him by making him a knight, and giving him a noble title. Sir Humphrey Gilbert. More than 300 years ago there lived in England a brave man whose name was Sir Humphrey Gilbert. At that time there were no white people in this country of ours. The land was covered with forests, and where there are now great cities and fine farms there were only trees and swamps among which roamed wild Indians and wild beasts. Sir Humphrey Gilbert was one of the first men who tried to make a settlement in America. Twice did he bring men and ships over the sea, and twice did he fail and sail back for England. The second time, he was on a little ship called the Squirrel. Another ship, called the Golden 30 Hind, was not far away. When they were 3 days from land, the wind failed, and the ships lay floating on the waves. Then at night the air grew very cold. A breeze sprang up from the east. Great white icebergs came drifting around them. In the morning the little ships were almost lost among the floating mountains of ice. The men on the Hind saw Sir Humphrey sitting on the deck of the Squirrel, with an open book in his hand. He called to them and said, "Be brave, my friends. We are as near heaven on the sea as on the land." Night came again. It was a stormy night, with mist and rain. All at once the men on the Hind saw the lights on board of the Squirrel go out. The little vessel, with brave Sir Humphrey and all his brave men, was swallowed up by the waves. Sir Walter Raleigh. There once lived in England a brave and noble man whose name was Walter Raleigh. He was not only brave and noble, but he was also handsome and polite, and for that reason the Queen made him a knight, and called him Sir Walter Raleigh. I will tell you about it. When Raleigh was a young man, he was one day walking along a street in London. At that time the streets were not paved, and there were no sidewalks. Raleigh was dressed in very fine style, and he wore a beautiful scarlet cloak thrown over his shoulders. As he passed along, he found it hard work to keep from stepping in the mud and soiling his handsome new shoes. Soon he came to a puddle of muddy water which reached from one side of the street to the other. He could not step across. Perhaps he could jump over it. As he was thinking what he should do, he happened to look up. Who was it coming down the street, on the other side of the puddle? It was Elizabeth, the Queen of England, with her train of gentlewomen and waiting maids. She saw the dirty puddle in the street. She saw the handsome young man with the scarlet cloak, standing by the side of it. How was she to get across? Young Raleigh, when he saw who was coming, forgot about himself. He thought only of helping the Queen. There was only one thing that he could do, and no other man would have thought of that. He took off his scarlet cloak and spread it across the puddle. The Queen could step on it now, as on a beautiful carpet. She walked across. She was safely over the ugly puddle, and her feet had not touched the mud. She paused a moment, and thanked the young man. As she walked onward with her train, she asked one of the gentlewomen, "Who is that brave gentleman who helped us so handsomely?" "His name is Walter Raleigh," said the gentlewoman. "He shall have his reward," said the Queen. Not long after that, she sent for Raleigh to come to her palace. The young man went, but he had no scarlet cloak to wear. Then, while all the great men and fine ladies of England stood around, the Queen made him a knight. And from that time he was known as Sir Walter Raleigh, the Queen's favorite. Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, about whom I have already told you, were half-brothers. When Sir Humphrey made his first voyage to America, Sir Walter was with him. After that, Sir Walter tried several times to send men to this country to make a settlement. But those whom he sent found only great forests, and wild beasts, and savage Indians. Some of them went back to England, some of them died for want of food, and some of them were lost in the woods. At last Sir Walter gave up trying to get people to come to America. But he found two things in this country which the people of England knew very little about. One was the potato, the other was tobacco. If you should ever go to Ireland, you may be shown the place where Sir Walter planted the few potatoes which he carried over from America. He told his friends how the Indians used them for food, and he proved that they would grow in the Old World as well as in the New. Sir Walter had seen the Indians smoking the leaves of the tobacco plant. He thought that he would do the same, and he carried some of the leaves to England. Englishmen had never used tobacco before that time, and all who saw Sir Walter puffing away at a roll of leaves thought that it was a strange sight. One day as he was sitting in his chair and smoking, his servant came into the room. The man saw the smoke curling over his master's head, and he thought that he was on fire. He ran out for some water. He found a pail that was quite full. He hurried back, and threw the water into Sir Walter's face. Of course the fire was all put out. After that a great many men learned to smoke. And now tobacco is used in all countries of the world. It would have been well if Sir Walter Raleigh had let it alone. Pocahontas. There was once a very brave man whose name was John Smith. He came to this country many years ago, when there were great woods everywhere, and many wild beasts and Indians. Many tales are told of his adventures, some of them true and some of them untrue. Among the latter is the following story. One day when Smith was in the woods, some Indians came upon him, and made him their prisoner. They led him to their king, and in a short time they made ready to put him to death. A large stone was brought in, and Smith was made to lie down with his head on it. Then 2 tall Indians with big clubs in their hands came forward. The king and all his great men stood around to see. The Indians raised their clubs. In another moment they would fall on Smith's head. But just then a little Indian girl rushed in. She was the daughter of the king, and her name was Pocahontas. She ran and threw herself between Smith and the uplifted clubs. She clasped Smith's head with her arms. She laid her own head upon his. "Oh, father," she cried, "spare this man's life. I am sure he has done you no harm, and we ought to be his friends." The men with the clubs could not strike, for they did not want to hurt the child. The king at first did not know what to do. Then he spoke to some of his warriors, and they lifted Smith from the ground. They untied the cords from his wrists and feet, and set him free. The next day the king sent Smith home, and several Indians went with him to protect him from harm. After that, as long as she lived, Pocahontas was the friend of the white men, and she did a great many things to help them. George Washington and his hatchet. When George Washington was quite a little boy, his father gave him a hatchet. It was bright and new, and George took great delight in going about and chopping things with it. He ran into the garden, and there he saw a tree which seemed to say to him, "Come and cut me down." George had often seen his father's men chop down the great trees in the forest, and he thought that it would be fine sport to see this tree fall with a crash to the ground. So he set to work with his little hatchet, and, as the tree was a very small one, it did not take long to lay it low. Soon after that, his father came home. "Who has been cutting my fine young cherry tree?" he cried. "It was the only tree of its kind in this country, and it cost me a great deal of money." He was very angry when he came into the house. "If I only knew who killed that cherry tree," he cried, "I would. Yes, I would." "Father," cried little George, "I will tell you the truth about it. I chopped the tree down with my hatchet." His father forgot his anger. "George," he said, and he took the little fellow in his arms, "George, I am glad that you told me about it. I would rather lose a dozen cherry trees than that you should tell one falsehood."